Okay, we're going to reconvene now with the next talk in the series, which I'm really excited to talk about. A few years ago on YouTube, I discovered this talk about living the good life. What does that mean? By Professor Bob Waldinger at Harvard. It was one of those things that's just disarming. It takes 12 minutes. Everybody that's seen it is disarmed by the core issues involved and by the nature of the data that comes back. So I am thrilled that we were able to get Bob's attention and persuade him to take time to come and visit us. So it was a little bit difficult because he's in such high demand. You may have seen him on ABC's Good Morning show on Sunday. I think it was January 8th. He was also on NBC Today show. This new book that he has, The Good Life, is quite popular, and his publisher is quite good at marketing. So getting on his calendar was a little hard. So thank you for being here. So for those of you who don't know Bob, let me just really quickly outline the basics here. Robert Waldinger has long studied life, balance, and happiness as a psychiatrist, a psychoanalyst, and a Zen priest, which I think he needs to talk to us a little more about. We're not that familiar with that part. He's a clinical professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, and he directs the Harvard Study of Adult Development, one of the longest running studies of adult development ever done. The study tracked the lives of two groups of men over 75 years, and now it follows their baby boomer children to understand how children experience reaches across decades and affect health and well-being in middle age. His research has inspired his famous TED Talk, What Makes a Good Life? Lessons from the Longest Study on Happiness. His new book, The Good Life, has attracted a lot of national attention. He's interviewed on a number of national TV programs and is just a national star. Everybody wants time from Bob, so I'm glad that he's with us now. He's studied how happiness develops, what works and what doesn't work by empirical data. Actually what? It's not theories. He was actually talking to real people from birth until at death. I don't know how many of the original 800 people in the study are still alive even, but about 40, so all the rest have lived their lives. So he's got the data from bookends to bookends. And what we're really concerned about in this conference is a slice of that data for what happens in the years between, say, 15 to 29, sort of education world. And what can we learn from this, Bob? And what do we need to hear in order to do a better job? Thank you very much for being here, Bob. Welcome to the podium.
I think I'll do what Bill did. I think I'll go kind of walk a little bit. First of all, it's really an honor to be here, and I just want to say that, you know, Rick makes it sound like I was really hard to get. As soon as Rick reached out to me and I heard what CLTE was about, it was like he had me at hello, because my work is about human lifespan development, and there's nothing more central than life transformative education. So I was on board pretty quickly. All right, let me tell you kind of what I know about the broader landscape of well-being that I hope has a relevance to the slice of development that you're all most concerned with. So this question of what well-being actually looks like is something that we've really only begun to study empirically probably in the last 30, 40 years. That prior to that, the assumption was that if gross domestic product was increasing, we were getting happier. That was basically it. That economic well-being, economic thriving was it. And then people began to realize that there was a huge disconnect here, that essentially that we found that as countries' GDP increased, well-being often went down, or at least was flat. And that in fact, economic prosperity was not a recipe for collective well-being. So, as I think many of you know, the UN has begun to study this quite systematically. Every year, the UN has a team of scientists all over the world, sociologists, demographers, psychologists, physicians, people from all walks of science, doing surveys. And one of the things they ask about is, what do you think you need to have a good life, to have a meaningful life? What are the essential components? And the most striking thing for the authors of the report was that the results are pretty consistent across the world, across age groups, across cultural groups, that the elements of a good life that people identify are remarkably consistent. So they do involve economic well-being. That one of the things we know is that having our basic needs met, food, shelter, clothing, education for our kids, access to health care, that level of economic well-being is essential. And so some of you know, I think it was in 2017, Daniel Kahneman and his group did a study of how much money do you need to make, how much does your happiness go up as you make more money? That was the question. And what he found was that as income increased up to about $75,000 a year, annual household income, that happiness increased markedly, significantly. But then after 75,000, and of course it varies around the country, certainly around the world, but after basic economic needs are met, then happiness, it doesn't quite flatline, but it goes up very little. You know, the difference between 75,000 and 75 million is surprisingly little. So that's important. So then the question is, what do people identify for these UN researchers at what they do need to have a good life? And the elements are things we've been talking about all morning: social support, healthy life expectancy, freedom to make life choices. And as we know, that varies tremendously around the world. Generosity, and that's an interesting one. You know, that people want opportunities to be generous, not just with money, but with expertise, with time, with energy. And again, all over the world, all age groups. And then finally, trust. And that's trust of our neighbors, but also trust of our governments. And again, such difference around the world. So if these are consistent year after year around the world, what do young people say they're going to need? And I think most of you are familiar with this as well. There was a famous survey in 2007 of millennials when they were of college age. And they basically asking them, what are your major life goals? And over 80% of millennials said that their primary life goal was going to be to get rich. Not just have their basic needs met, but to be rich. And another, those same millennials, about half of them said that another essential life goal was to become famous, which is a strange goal if you think about it. And a third goal was to achieve a great deal at work. Now, wealth, fame, and high achievement were not on that UN list. So the question is, what's responsible for the disconnect? And of course, there's a lot of speculation about this. But, oh, there's my fame and high achievement slide. The disconnect seems to have a great deal to do with storytelling, with the stories that we tell each other all day, every day, about what's going to make us happy. You know, if we think about it, all day what a good life is defined for us. It's defined in advertising, certainly. You know, if you buy this car, you're going to be so happy. If you serve this brand of pasta, you're going to have blissful family dinners. I mean, so many subliminal messages about what we need to do to be happy. Similarly, we've spoken already about social media, and I pulled this from Facebook. It's, you know, one of those typical photos of people at a great party. And, you know, if you think about it, if you were coming from outer space and your source of information was social media about human life, you would think we were always at great parties, we were always eating magnificent plates of food, we were on beautiful beaches, because we curate our lives for each other on social media. Again, not new, but as we know, particularly many of our students, even though perhaps they are aware of this, the fact that nobody's posting their hangover pictures or their really miserable pictures, that it can lead to this sense that, well, everybody else is having a great life. Everybody else has life figured out except me. One of my teachers put it this way, and I really love this, that we're always comparing our insides to other people's outsides. You know, our insides that are sometimes happy and excited, and we feel a lot of agency, and sometimes we feel lost and confused. Similarly, we get messages, and again, young people are quite subject to these difficulties. We get messages about what we're supposed to look like, what our bodies are supposed to look like. So I deliberately chose a male body. This is a typical underwear ad. But we know female bodies are much more commonly exploited in this way. You know, when was the last time we were shown this kind of ad from the ad agencies? You know, this sense that, again, we know these are not real, and yet they are. They give us the sense that this is who we're supposed to be, and this is what we're supposed to look like. And so it's no wonder that young people come into a situation like college education and say, well, this is who I'm supposed to be, this is what I'm supposed to want. All right, so we also talked about memory this morning. I'm starting to make a case for why I've spent most of my adult life doing the same thing over and over again. So most research about what really life is like for lots of people, most research asks people to remember the past. 97% of research in psychology is retrospective. And that's a perfectly valid way to collect information. It's just that, as we've already heard, our memories are quite fallible, full of systematic errors. Dan Schachter, as you know, wrote a great book called The 7 Sins of Memory, in which he talks about some of the most common systematic errors that recall is heir to. So the recency effect, the fact that we're much more likely to remember and give weight to things that happened more recently. The emotional salience. So, you know, if I have a great vacation, but I have an argument with my son on the last day, a really bad one, I'm really likely to remember the argument as most of what the vacation was about. And similarly, suggestibility, that we can actually induce false memories in one another. It's one of the things that drives the legal profession crazy, because eyewitness data can be subject to all kinds of powerful errors. Okay. Sorry, I'm not sure where. There, okay. So why not just take snapshots of people at one point in time? You know, this study has been going for 85 years that I'm going to be telling you about. Millions of dollars of taxpayer money. Why invest in this when you could study anything, any variable in a group of 20-year-olds and 40-year-olds and 60-year-olds and 80-year-olds. Why not? It's much cheaper, much quicker. You can get your publications much faster than you do doing a longitudinal study of lifespan development. Well, what happens is that if we take snapshots and connect the dots and think that we are looking at how human life proceeds, we can make false connections. So the best explanation of this comes from Claude Pepper. You might remember he was a senator from the state of Florida. And he once quoted, when I look at South Florida, I would have to believe that you are born Cuban and you die Jewish. And that was his way of saying, if you look at any point in time, you can imagine that you see a trajectory that is not real. Again, so this is my case for doing what I do, which is the Harvard study of adult development. And as Rick told you, it is, as far as we know, the longest study of any depth of the same individuals going through life from adolescence all the way to death. It began in 1938, and it began with two studies that didn't know about each other. One study started at the Harvard Student Health Service with a group of 19-year-old sophomores, all young men who were chosen by their deans as fine, upstanding specimens. And the idea was to do a study of normal development from adolescence to young adulthood. So of course, if you want to study normal development, you study all white males from Harvard. I mean, we are constantly explaining to NIH why it's still worth funding us, because, you know. But the other study that was started was at Harvard Law School. It was started by Sheldon Gluck, a law professor, and Eleanor Gluck, who was a social worker. And they were interested in juvenile delinquency, and particularly in how some children from Boston's poorest and most disadvantaged, most troubled families, how those kids managed to stay out of trouble, how they managed to stay on good developmental paths. So this is 2/3 of our sample, 1/3 is the Harvard College undergraduates. And then eventually my predecessor, George Valiant, brought these two studies together and studied them as contrasting groups. Again, all white males, because the city of Boston in 1938 was 97.4% white. The waves of migration of people of color didn't happen until after World War II. So we have since achieved a fair degree of gender balance. We brought in spouses of the original men, and then we reached out to the second generation and have studied over 1,300 children who are on average in their 60s, so baby boomers, but still almost all Caucasian. So when these young men were brought into the study, they were given medical exams, psychiatric exams. Workers went to their homes and interviewed the parents, heard all about the grandparents' lives, took elaborate notes on what was being served for dinner and what the style of discipline was in the home. Wonderful. It's a wonderful sociologic experience to sit down and read through one of these files. And then the Harvard men were of an age to go to World War II, and so almost all did that, came back, and then all of them grew up to be doctors, lawyers, factory workers. John F. Kennedy was a member of the study. Ben Bradley, longtime editor of the Washington Post. And the only reason I can tell you their names is because they were outed in other ways. Ben Bradley wrote about the study in his autobiography. John F. Kennedy was named by a journalist a bunch of years ago. Otherwise, we maintain complete confidentiality about the identities of our participants, because otherwise, why would they tell us important personal information about themselves? And then as people got older, we began to study aging and retirement. Then we reached out to their children. So what basically has been studied? Well, we have been called by one scientist the biggest fishing expedition in the history of science, because we study the big domains of adult life. We study mental health, physical health, World War II experiences, work life. We study satisfaction, promotions, who got fired and when, income, relationships, which I'll tell you a lot about, and eventually aging and retirement. So then the question is methods. How did we study this? Well, we began, as I said, with interviews, physical exams, and they started using some newfangled technology in 1938. They did EEGs when EEG was new. So we have EEG tracings. We don't know what to do with them, so if anyone wants to use them. And then we are sort of a history of science. So we've studied these same domains, but bringing in different methodologies. So we began eventually to audio tape people, videotape people, talking with their spouses about their deepest concerns. We brought them into our lab and deliberately stressed them out and watched how they recovered from stress. We drew blood for DNA and mRNA. And this is amazing to me because in 1938, when the studies were begun, DNA wasn't even imagined. We put people in the scanners and scanned their brains as they viewed different types of images. So then the question is, well, what have we learned? And of course, it's been, several hundred papers and I think 12 books. But the biggest takeaways were two. One, of course, will not surprise you. It is that if you take care of your health, it really matters for longevity and disability-free years of life. Hugely impactful. That wasn't new. What was new was the finding that began to emerge in our data in the 90s, that the people who stayed healthiest, longest, and who lived the longest were the people who had the warmest connections with others. See it there, yeah. People who were more connected, had broader networks, who literally saw more people in a given week, but then also people who had the warmest relationships with others. So, it wasn't simply the size of your network. There, yeah. But it was the extent to which these relationships felt supportive and satisfying. We didn't believe our own data at first because, we pay lip service to the mind-body connection, but how could relationships get into your body and predict the likelihood of your getting coronary artery disease or type 2 diabetes or rheumatoid arthritis? And how could it be predictive of these multiple things that seem to have so little connection with each other? Other studies began to find the same thing. Now it's quite a robust finding, quite well accepted, this degree of connection between social functioning and health and longevity. So then the question is, how does it work? Because as a researcher, we always want to know, well, what's the mechanism by which this happens? The connections, I'm sorry, yeah, okay. One of the things you may have read is that loneliness, which is the opposite of good social connections, has been calculated to be as powerful a predictor of poor health as smoking a half a pack of cigarettes a day, as being obese, as having untreated high blood pressure. So the consequences are quite tangible. What we know is that intimacy keeps us alive, that married people live longer. Men get a bigger boost in longevity from marriage than women. Women will always tell you marriage is a better deal for men than for women, and it is in terms of longevity, but women get a longevity boost as well. and that there's some very good research coming out of both University of Chicago and Rush Medical School about slower cognitive decline among people who are more socially engaged and socially active. Okay, so then the question is what are the mechanisms by which this works? It's very clear that stress and loneliness are associated with heightened cardiovascular reactivity, with decreased immune function, and with chronic inflammation. And what we think is involved is that loneliness and isolation are stressors, that we evolved probably to be social animals, that you survive better in packs, and that isolation is a stressor, and that puts us into a kind of chronic flight or fight mode, meaning that we'll have higher levels of circulating stress hormones like cortisol, we'll have chronic inflammation. And we believe that those changes in the body that are ongoing are involved with the gradual breakdown of these multiple body systems that I just named. So one of the things that's fun about doing longitudinal work is repeated measures. You ask the same questions over and over again if you have the foresight to do that. So we ask the same questions of our participants about marriage, the same 6 questions. We ask them 8 times over 50 years, and what we find is consistent with other studies that we're like most excited about our partners when we first get together. No surprise. That satisfaction takes a nosedive when the first child is born, and that it goes up again only after the last child leaves home. And then the other thing they find when they follow it up further is that marital satisfaction only goes down again if kids come back to live at home. And now needless to say, not every couple works this way. These are studies of thousands of marriages, and they are studies of marriages in the West, particularly the United States, because many other cultures have traditions where people live at home. People live at home until they're married, and sometimes after they're married. So this is one of the clear cases where this is pretty culturally and generationally based, but it turns out, it's an illustration of how repeated measures can allow us to see trajectories that you can't otherwise see when you do more snapshot research. The other thing we see is that relationships do not have to be smooth all the time. No relationship of any consequence is without conflict or difficulty. And what we find empirically is that it is how couples work with differences and conflicts, how any dyad in a relationship works with differences, that really makes the difference in whether a relationship is satisfying and stable. So for example, we brought couples into our lab and had them argue with each other about things they usually argue about, and they were just off to the races arguing. They would forget it. They knew they were being recorded and everything, but they would just forget about the camera and just go to it. But our raters who would watch the videos could see that, and then we followed them up 5 years later to say, okay, which couples were going to still be together? This was not in the Harvard study, this was earlier research. And what we found was that the degree of anger in the argument did not predict who was going to stay together. It was whether our raters could see on video flickers of affection and respect even while they were having an argument, and that the couples who showed affection and respect while they were fighting were the ones who were much more likely to stay together and be satisfied. So the other thing that you get to see as you follow people over time is that human beings get happier as they get older. I mean, when I was in college, I used to look at, first of all, my parents, who I thought were incredibly old, and then grandparent types, and think, oh, it must be so depressing. And what we know when we follow mood is that as a species, we get happier as we age. So we know that older people have fewer conflicts in their relationships. There's more affection expressed even when having arguments among older people compared with younger people. So how is it that we get happier? Well, some of this comes from the work of Laura Karstensen and her group at Stanford. And we've done some work in this area as well in our longitudinal study, that when we have the sense that death is real, that time is really limited, which starts to creep in middle age, that we actually start to prioritize our own well-being more. We stop going to those meetings that we've always hated. We just kind of let go of them. We stop seeing those people who have been annoying us for years, but we've always felt obligated to see. And you can literally document this in people's behavior. Similarly, we pay more attention to positively valenced information. That one of the things that we know about human cognition is that we are biased to take in and remember valenced information when we are younger. And that's thought to be adaptive, that if you can see threats on the horizon, that has great survival benefit. But that bias toward the negative shifts as we get older, starting about in the mid-40s, it shifts so that older people remember what's positive, they take it in and they remember it more. And these are older people who have all their cognitive faculties intact. So this bias shifts. And it's one of the reasons why people get happier. We remember the past more positively, so we reconstruct our memories. We talked about that this morning. And what we find is that we tend to idealize our past much more as we get older. And as I said, we get choosier about who we spend time with and how we spend our time. And we savor the present moment because life begins to feel more like a real gift and something that we can't take for granted. And I see some of you nodding in the room because it's like you get it. But it's something that we can't necessarily teach younger people. It is an experiential learning. Okay, the other thing that you can find out when you study what makes people happy is how do we use our discretionary income? And does that make a difference in what makes us happy? So researchers have found that they ask the question, if you have money to spend on pleasure, on entertainment, is it better to buy a material object or is it better to buy an experience? And what makes us happier and how long does the happiness last? And as I'm sure you can guess, the best things in life aren't things, they're experiences. That when we pay for material objects, we're not as happy, and we're not as happy for as long as we are when we pay for experiences like, I don't know, tickets to a basketball game or a trip to a museum or a family vacation. Again, we need to study the mechanisms. How does this work? Why are we happier? Why are we less happy with material objects? Well, one of the things we know is that material objects beg for comparison. And that developmental science tells us that the more often we compare ourselves to others each day, the less happy we are. So they've done lots of studies where they will literally page people and ask them, how recently have you compared yourself to another person? And people will answer all day long. And what we find is that the more we compare ourselves, the less satisfied we are. And experiences are less likely to be compared than, the flat screen TV that I went out and bought and am so proud of. The other thing is that experiences tend to bring us closer to other people, either to people we already know or we encounter new people. This is my family and I took a trip to Alaska one summer, and this was the little boat I was always on as we went and explored glaciers, and I got to know these people, and it was a You know, it was a wonderful experience, not like anybody else's that I know of, and my family and I have lots of good memories of that trip. So, okay, I've just been telling you about the data that that should be convincing us of the importance of interpersonal connection, not just for happiness, but for physical health. Bowling Alone is Robert Putnam's famous book from the 1980s. Robert Putnam is a sociologist at Harvard who did a study of what he called social capital, which is basically how much are we investing in each other. And that means, like, do we join bowling leagues? Do we go to houses of worship? Do we invite people over to our homes? Do we have family dinners, family vacations? And what he found was a dramatic drop-off starting in the 1950s in the United States. And it seemed to coincide with the advent of television, that people stayed home and stared at the tube alongside their families, but no one spoke. Lots of TVs running during family dinners. And what Putnam found when he went back in the early 2000s and measured the same parameters was that everything had declined again pretty dramatically, so that in the previous 25 years, joining clubs and civic organizations was down by more than half from the earlier decline. Family dinners, family vacations were down. In 1983, when he did his survey, 12% of Americans said that they did not have a confidant, that there was no one they could talk to about personal matters. And in 2003, 25%, 1 in 4, said there was nobody on the planet that they could talk to about any personal matters. And we understand that that number has continued to go down. So one of the things we know is that screens have accelerated this trend toward declining investment in each other. And there's been a lot of attempts to document the extent to which this has accelerated. It was happening before the digital revolution, but it has certainly accelerated. And what we find is that we stop looking at what's around us. We stop, for example, taking in the natural world. Some of you must know this iconic photo, you know, and of course we have our own versions of it. You look around at a restaurant and you'll see people all together at a dinner, but everybody's on their phone. Sometimes they're texting each other rather than making eye contact, you know. So then the question is, well, what do we do about this? And I think we've all been, this is what we're here to talk about. And for this, I've pulled a quote from one of my Zen teachers, John Tarrant, who said, "Attention is the most basic form of love." And if you think about it, our undivided attention is probably the greatest gift we have to give to each other. But how hard is it to put down our phones? How hard is it to, you know, Linda Stone is a writer who talks about us all giving each other now continuous partial attention. I mean, my wife and I come down to the kitchen in the morning and she's on her email and I'm kind of scrolling through the news, and we realize that we haven't looked at each other. We've hardly said anything to each other, and we're actually pretty happily married. And so I think, you know, so there's a great deal to be said for looking at how we deploy our attention. And as we know, you know, software designers make money by capturing and holding our attention. It's not evil, it's just capitalism, right? But the idea is to essentially take us away from each other. All right, so there's a lot of preventive medicine to be had, and I won't go into all the possibilities, but you know, if we think about date nights for people who've been in relationships for a long time, family dinners. One of my colleagues has what she has labeled the Family Dinner Project, where she is looking at, first of all, the startling decline in families eating together regularly, and the amazing benefits for child and adolescent development when families do eat together regularly. And then, of course, volunteering in the community, which is such a source of connection. I know we're going to hear from people from the Gallup organization, but I just want to call this out because it's so important in terms of our work lives, that the Gallup organization did their famous poll of 15 million workers asking, do you have a best friend at work? And what they found was that people who had a best friend at work were better at their jobs, better at engaging customers if they were customer facing, they were better workers, they enjoyed their jobs more, they were less likely to get injured on the job. But only 30% of employees responded to this survey saying that they had a friend at work. The other thing is that the people who didn't have a friend at work, reportedly 11 out of 12 said they were not engaged in their jobs. They were sort of quietly checked out. So engagement seems to have a lot to do with whether we feel connected to the other people with whom we work. And the last thing, and I think this is for all of us who are in positions of leadership, when they surveyed CEOs, half of CEOs reported feeling lonely. So this epidemic of loneliness is very much at all levels of every organization. All right. So one of the things that actually Vivek Murthy has been talking about, our Surgeon General, is how important it is to create cultures in workplaces, and we're talking about cultures in academic institutions, where social connections become a priority. That they are not just niceties, things that happen by accident on the side, that they become a priority. That we encourage people to give and receive help, we encourage vulnerability, that we create opportunities for people to learn about each other's lives. And again, everything we've been hearing about this morning is about that. And then tomorrow morning, I will talk to you about a program that we have created that's an effort to kind of enhance connection and well-being and teach, based on the principles of lifespan developmental science. But it's just one of the wonderful, rich programs that we're going to hear about. So take-home messages are pretty simple, that human connection is not just a source of happiness, but of physical health. That technology certainly has the power to connect us, but it has great power to isolate us, and that we can actively structure our lives at home and at school and at work to combat social isolation, but the path of least resistance over decades now has been increasing social isolation. So we need to be much more intentional and active if we're going to counter these powerful trends. And I think that's it. So thank you for your attention. So I'm happy. Do we have 15 minutes? Okay, good. We have 15 minutes. But you don't have to use it all. You could go do something else. But thoughts, questions, complaints? Yeah.
Thank you. We didn't hear about your Zen priesthood.
I'll tell you about that if you want to know.
Wondering if you could maybe talk about the connection between meditation as a practice and mindfulness practices and connection with others.
Absolutely.
Which seems contradictory on the surface, but.
Absolutely. I mean, it's interesting because I used to think that my Zen life and my research life and my clinical life, because I see patients in psychotherapy, I thought they were like separate silos, and now I realize it's all the same thing. It's all windows on the human experience. And so, You know, so basically what I can tell you about is my experience as a meditator. I've been meditating for 20 years and very involved in Zen. And my experience is that sitting on a cushion is one way of getting to know the experience of being alive, right? All the crap that comes up in my mind, right? And that you become much more accepting. I can't remember, I think maybe it was Bill who talked about acceptance being the first step, right? And one of the things about a meditative practice is if you have good teaching to go with it, is there's a lot of acceptance. Like, oh my gosh, this is what's going on in my mind all day long. And then you realize what you come to understand is this is what's going on in everybody's minds. And that generates a kind of compassion for human foibles and for human differences that's really helpful. So that's my kind of quick and dirty response to, but I see them now as very connected, a meditative practice and much more empathy for and compassion for other people. Yeah.
Right. Here I am, back here.
Hi.
I often wondered, or I actually wished my husband would be part of this kind of a study, because then I could say, they're going to ask you about this in 5 years. And so I'm wondering, we've been married 40 years, so we're doing good.
Yeah.
But I often wondered how the people in the study benefited from being in the study.
Oh, thank you for asking that. So we are, first of all, again, we are violating the purest scientific method, right? Because you can't be a hands-off longitudinal study. So most longitudinal studies fall apart before the 10-year mark because too many people drop out, and it's scientifically not useful to continue to study the remnants. We've had an 84% retention rate over 85 years. So the question is, how have we done that? Well, my predecessors were dogged about staying in touch. They sent, like, when someone would return a questionnaire, they'd send a thank you note. They sent birthday cards. People knew that they could come to us for referrals for doctors and therapists. In the early days, in the 1940s and 50s, some of my predecessors made small loans to people who were in trouble. And so what happens is that, and so to your question more directly, we actually asked people a few years ago, how has being in the study affected you? And some people said, didn't make any difference. And some people said, your questions are a damn nuisance. But most people said, it was a profoundly impactful part of my life because I knew that every few years you were going to ask me about my life. And so I had that in the back of my mind as I went through my days and made my choices. So we know it impacted them. And of course, what we'd like is to have a matched cohort that never went through the study, but we can't know the effects. So this is, I'm telling you, like a lot of the scientific limitations. This is not a pure experimental method, as you can imagine. But if you want to do a longitudinal study, I think you have to have some of these procedures that build and maintain community among the people. Yeah.
Hi, I'd like to follow up again on your comments on meditation. Part of my area of interest is teaching and scholarship in the area of mindfulness meditation.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering your thoughts on not obviously the benefit, but the scalability of the cultivation of that orientation of awareness that supports many of the things that we've heard this morning.
So, I mean, are you thinking about mindfulness and meditation per se, or? Oh, sorry, you can't now. Just yell. Just yeah. Okay. Yes, yeah, yeah.
But there's, broader approaches for
Yes.
cultivating the kind of
Yeah.
awareness that
Yeah.
really supports
Yeah.
this understanding of connection and acceptance.
Absolutely, absolutely. And in my experience, and there's been some good research on this, actually out of Brown, that meditation is not for everybody. It really isn't. It is not a panacea. That some people find it, nourishing and grounding and all that good stuff, and some people can't stand it. They try it and they just run the other way. And my sense, I'm interested in these ideas about flow, that I think that if we're lucky and if we can find practices that allow us to be in a kind of absorbed state, a positive state of absorption, that could be skiing, that could be gardening, there's so many ways that people can do this. It doesn't have to be meditating on a cushion. But I think that helping people to think about what are activities you're in where time just flies, where you're just completely in it, that those tend to be nourishing activities in terms of replenishing our energy. So I don't try to, when people complain to me, I don't like meditation and I feel so bad about it, I really say, don't feel bad about that. That's just not for you. Yeah.
Hi. Hello.
Hi. This is really.
Thank you, Robert. It was a great conversation that you started. I'm really curious about, you talked a lot about social media and its effect on our health, our mental well-being especially, and connection. But I also know that, we're here to talk about the current student state and what a lot of our Gen Z students are experiencing in particular. And I know that there are some studies, and from personal experience talking to students currently, sometimes social media and internet and that sphere is more of a connection space for them too. So I'm wondering if you can speak to how can students or how can any adult engage in social media and that sphere in a way that is healthy for them and builds connection.
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked, because I could end up giving the impression that social media is bad. And first of all, it's not going away. But there has been some research. So Jean Twenge is one of the researchers who's looking at how we use social media and its relationship to our well-being. And the sort of early findings are that if we use social media actively to connect with other people, it very much enhances well-being. So that, if you find, actually a friend of mine reconnected with his elementary school friends on Zoom during the lockdown, during COVID, and now they have coffee every Sunday morning on Zoom, and they're just thrilled. It's really enhanced their well-being. Okay, that's an active use of social media. On the other hand, what the studies show is that if we essentially doom scroll through other people's feeds, like Instagram and other people's curated lives, that lowers well-being. It heightens depression, it lowers self-esteem, it raises anxiety, it develops that fear of missing out, I'm just not doing life right. So it seems to be a difference between active engagement to foster connection on social media versus passive consumption. And I'm sure research is only just beginning, and we're going to know a lot more in the coming years about this. Yeah.
Thanks. One of the things I loved most about the book was that it provided a sense of hope and optimism for so many individuals, particularly students who are introverts. Yes. And so you give practical advice. Could you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. The person who wrote the book about this is Susan Cain, right, who wrote the book Quiet. And, extroversion is valorized in our culture, right? Like the party animal, the outgoing, super friendly Ted Lasso type, right? I really like Ted Lasso, but introversion is pathologized, and there's nothing pathological about being shy, nothing. And so first of all, the question is, how can we destigmatize shyness? And then I think what we've learned is that some people need very few people in their lives, and having too many people is quite stressful. And so I think that, that's why, sometimes people will ask, well, what's the ideal number of social connections you should have? There's absolutely no ideal number. It's highly individual. And it's a subjective experience of being as connected as you want to be or not as connected as you want to be. But I think, that's probably one of the things we could do a lot more with, particularly for undergraduate students, particularly for people, because they enter often these big social worlds. And what's it like to not be the person who wants to go to the parties, but who wants a few friends that I can have kind of deeper conversations with? One of the things we do find, our study, is that everybody, we think, needs one or two what we call securely attached relationships. So, and what that means, like at one point we asked our original folks, who could you call in the middle of the night if you were sick or scared? List everybody. And most of them could list quite a number of people. Some of them couldn't list anyone, and some of them were married and couldn't list anyone. And what we think is that those people are in trouble, and that's a source of enormous stress and health decline. So that we think that whether you're shy or extroverted, everybody needs one or two people who they feel like would just be there in times of need. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your presentation and for your work for the book. So I had a couple of thoughts that I just wanted to share and maybe get your perspective on. So one is just, I realized how challenging it is in hearing you describe both the comparison urge for young adults who are going through this identity formation period that, of course, you're looking for examples and role models. So comparison is an urge that makes sense, but then the comparison is often pressured and externalized. And there aren't a lot of opportunities to kind of model the insides. We don't get to see that a lot.
Yes.
Art maybe is one area, but we see often the finished products and not the struggles and the efforts to get there.
And don't you think the stories that you were talking about are one way to model the inside, right?
Exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's not a way that I had been thinking about, but I thought modeling the inside, that really is what we're trying to do. And at different stages, too. It doesn't all have to be perfect.
Yeah.
It also made me think we need more intergenerational opportunities.
Oh, yeah.
And it's just prompted me to think that we need to include grandparents more in students' lives and hear more about what those relationships are like.
Absolutely. One of the things we started doing, as we know, older people suffered hugely during the lockdown from the isolation and from the separation. And so we started getting some of the younger people in our community in Boston to start asking over Zoom, just asking their grandparents, how did you get through big life stresses? How did you get through World War II? How did you get through, to kind of, and then the younger people were thrilled to hear about, well, we had these big global crises and this is what happened and this is how I got through it. And, so just kind of tapping into some of the life experience of older people can be so helpful for both.
Right.
Yeah.
And just on the social media point, I really appreciated that because I know that, not that there aren't other issues with it, but say with TikTok, there is kind of a Gen Z, like, TikTok theme of, like, being in your grandparents' house and showing elderly folks and there being a lot of positivity and support around that. And that's one way to connect lots of different kinds of people, young people, to those experiences, bringing their family into the story.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, given the diverse students that most of us serve, and they don't have anywhere remotely near the demographics of this study. How do we translate what you've learned here to help us move forward with supporting those students?
Yeah, really important. So, I mean, what I want to argue is that most of what we present, and particularly what we present in the book and what I talked about here, is borne out in studies of other groups, of other ethnic and racial populations. So most of it we think is, but there are some things that are just different. And so I think a lot of this involves learning. I mean, I bet, for example, I bet when you created the Black experience, designing Black experiences or Muslim experiences, that you learned stuff that was just different, right? And so I think the point is that we don't take anything developed with one group and assume that that we can just transfer it. And you know, I'm stating the obvious, but I think it is really important because we can develop these things and think they apply to everybody, and they don't. So I just think it just means doing that kind of work. And I think I'll just end it there, but it's a really vital point. Okay. Yeah.